The cattle car jolted violently, throwing Lieutenant against the wooden wall. For 3 days, the train had rattled across the American countryside, its iron wheels grinding through the silence between exhaustion and fear. The air inside was thick and sour, heavy with sweat and unspoken dread. 47 German women, communications officers, nurses, clerks, sat huddled together, their once crisp uniforms now creased and dusty. None of them knew where they were being taken, only that they were prisoners of war in the hands of the enemy. When the train screeched to a stop, pressed her face to the small barred window. Beyond the iron grating, she saw neat rows of fences and guard towers rising against the pale Mississippi sky. "Where are we?" whispered Sergeant Anna, clutching her sleeve. The answer was low, resigned. "An American prison camp, Camp Clinton." They had all heard the stories, propaganda whispered in Germany's training halls and shouted in its newspapers. American captivity, they were told, meant starvation, humiliation, and slow death under the guise of civilized warfare. No one left those camps alive, the officers said. So when the steel doors of the cattle car slid open with a grinding shriek, every woman braced herself for the cruelty she'd been taught to expect. But instead of shouts and blows, they heard a calm voice. "Ladies, please step down carefully. The platform is wet, watch your footing." Standing in the sunlight was an American sergeant, tall, clean-uniformed, and astonishingly polite. He even spoke careful German. "I am Sergeant Williams," he said, offering a gloved hand to help each woman down. "Welcome to Camp Clinton, Mississippi. You'll be processed, assigned quarters, and given orientation. Please follow the line." Hesitated before stepping down, her legs weak from the journey. The man's tone was courteous, almost respectful, a courtesy that made her more suspicious than reassured. Around her, the others exchanged wary glances. The guards were armed, but their rifles were slung casually. Their posture was military, but not menacing. The sight unsettled the German women more than threats ever could. Sergeant Williams noticed their silence. "Ma'am," he said to her in English, "you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention, adequate food, medical care, and housing. You'll remain here until repatriation after the war." Anna stared at him, disbelieving. "But we are your enemies," she said through halting translation. Williams nodded. "You were. The war isn't over yet, but you're prisoners now, and prisoners have rights. We follow the law." As they marched through the camp gates, felt her chest tighten. Everything around her contradicted the image of barbaric America she had carried across the ocean. The grounds were orderly, swept clean. The guards spoke in measured voices, not barks. Even the wooden buildings looked solid, freshly painted, the windows intact. And then she saw something that made her stop cold. In the courtyard beyond the gate, German prisoners' men were playing soccer. They were laughing, shouting in their own language, healthy and sun-browned. American soldiers stood nearby, watching with mild amusement. None of the prisoners looked starved or beaten. None looked afraid. "My God," whispered Corporal, one of the signal operators. "They look normal." For the first time, doubt crept into his voice. "Maybe they're putting on a show," she murmured, "to confuse us." But the illusion didn't break. Every step toward the processing building peeled away another layer of what the Reich had told them. Inside, they were met not by interrogators, but by a woman, a uniformed American officer with dark hair pulled back neatly beneath her cap. She smiled slightly. "Welcome," she said in fluent German. "I'm Captain Mary. You'll be processed one by one. Please have patience. You'll be given water and a meal afterward." Water, a meal, simple words, but to the women who had expected chains and shouting, they sounded unreal. Sat stiffly in the chair as Captain reviewed her papers. "Lieutenant," she read aloud. "Communications Corps captured near Aachen." Her tone was calm, professional. "Any medical needs?" Shook her head, her throat dry. "Very well," the captain said, and handed her a folded document printed neatly in German. "Your rights as a prisoner of war. Keep this with you." When unfolded it, her hands trembled. The words were simple, almost bureaucratic: rights to adequate food, clothing, shelter, and correspondence. Protection from abuse. Access to medical care. It was all there in writing. She had never expected that her first act as a captive would be to receive a guarantee of dignity. That night, as the German women were led to their barracks, glanced through the wire fence one last time. Somewhere beyond the floodlights, American soldiers were laughing quietly, their silhouettes easy and unthreatening. She couldn't understand it. Why treat enemies with decency? Why pretend at humanity when victory was theirs to enforce through power? As she lay down on a clean bed with real sheets for the first time in months, one thought refused to leave her. If this was captivity, then maybe everything she had been taught about America and about herself was a lie. Morning light spilled through the barracks windows, golden and warm, not the harsh glare of interrogation lamps had imagined during the journey. For a long moment, she simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, unsure where she was. Then came the quiet sounds that didn't belong in a prison. Laughter, footsteps on gravel, the faint thud of a ball being kicked somewhere outside. The women around her were stirring too, whispering in disbelief. "Did you sleep?" Anna asked softly. "Like a child," admitted, "and that frightens me more than anything." A young American corporal entered the barracks carrying a clipboard. His tone was brisk but courteous. "Good morning, ladies. Breakfast is at 0700 in the dining hall. You'll find clean clothing and personal supplies in your lockers." When he left, the room erupted in murmurs. Clean clothing? Supplies? The lockers stood neatly against the far wall, each one marked with a small name tag. Inside were fresh undergarments, towels, soap, and even toothbrushes wrapped in paper. Corporal Weber turned on the faucet in the washroom and gasped aloud as steam curled upward. "Hot water," she said, eyes wide. "In a prison camp." The women stood silently, staring at the rising mist as if it were an illusion. For months before their capture, they'd lived in bombed-out barracks, rationing cold water and powdered soap. Yet here, in enemy hands, they had comforts that had vanished from Germany long ago. By the time they reached the dining hall, disbelief had turned into uneasy silence. The building was clean, well lit, with rows of long wooden tables. On one side, American cooks served steaming trays of eggs, bread, and oatmeal. The smell was overwhelming, real food, not thin soup or ersatz coffee. "Form a line, ladies," said an older American cook in broken German. "Plenty for everyone." Anna leaned close to, "This must be some kind of trick." "Then it's a very convincing one," murmured. Each woman received a full plate, warm bread, potatoes, vegetables, and a small slice of meat. Hesitated before taking a bite. It tasted ordinary, honest, better even than the food she'd eaten during her last months in the Reich. At the next table, a German woman with short blonde hair, a communications sergeant named, caught her eye. "You're new," she said between bites. "You'll get used to it." "Used to what?" asked. "To being treated like a human being." The words stunned her, had expected bitterness or resentment, not calm acceptance. "They feed you like this every day." "3 times a day," replied. "Same rations as their own soldiers. There's a canteen too. You can earn tokens if you work in the laundry or kitchen." Frowned, "Work for the Americans." "Not for them," corrected gently. "For ourselves, they say it gives us purpose." Purpose, that word lingered in his mind as the day unfolded. After breakfast, they were marched, not driven, to the camp's orientation building. The guards walked alongside them, rifles slung but never raised. Their faces were calm, even friendly. When a woman stumbled, one guard reached out instinctively to steady her. "Easy there, ma'am," he said, the word ma'am sounding strange, almost disarming in its respect. Inside, the prisoners were addressed by Captain Mary again, the same officer from the day before. She stood at a wooden desk, speaking German fluently, her voice neither harsh nor indulgent. "You are now residents of Camp Clinton," she said. "As prisoners of war, you will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will have access to medical care, correspondence with your families, and recreational activities. If you wish, you may also participate in educational programs." Educational programs? The phrase drew murmurs across the room. "You will find that cooperation brings privileges," continued. "Not betrayal, but opportunity. Your behavior will determine your freedom within these walls." Listened carefully, trying to detect manipulation beneath the polished tone, but found none. Its authority came not from fear, but from principle. It unsettled her more than threats ever could. That evening back in the barracks, the women gathered quietly to process the day's revelations. Sergeant was the first to speak. "They're playing with us," she insisted. "No enemy treats captives this way. They want to soften us, make us talk." "Talk about what?" asked calmly. "Our units, our superiors, the war, over for us, what's left to tell." Honor exhaled. "If this is manipulation, it's the kindest kind I've ever seen." Didn't answer. She stared at the copy of the Geneva Convention she'd been given, tracing her finger over the printed lines. Adequate rations, humane treatment, protection from violence. It was all there, respected. That night after lights out, she couldn't sleep. The barracks was quiet except for the faint murmur of distant laughter, German laughter, from somewhere near the recreation yard. for the first time in years, felt safe. But safety brought no comfort, only confusion. If the Americans weren't the monsters she'd been told to hate, then what did that make the people who had told her the lies weeks past, and what had begun as disbelief slowly transformed into a quiet reckoning? Every day at Camp Clinton eroded another piece of what Lieutenant had been taught to believe about her enemies. The Americans followed schedules with near-religious precision: breakfast at dawn, roll call, work assignments, recreation hours, lights out. But beneath the order was something she hadn't expected in captivity: respect. As adjusted to her new role as a translator for the camp's administrative office, a position offered after Captain noticed her fluent English, she began to see the full machinery of the camp from the inside. Files meticulously kept on every prisoner, records of medical visits, dietary adjustments, personal requests, weekly inspections by Red Cross representatives. It wasn't propaganda, it was accountability. "Every procedure is documented," explained one afternoon as assisted her with prisoner forms. "If a complaint is made, it must be investigated. If a violation occurs, it's recorded and corrected." Frowned, even if it's a German prisoner complaining against an American guard. "Especially then," replied. "The rule of law means nothing if it only applies to one side." The words echoed in his mind long after the meeting ended. Back home in Germany, the concept of fairness had long ago been replaced by loyalty to the party, to the fatherland. Yet here, in enemy hands, justice was treated like a shared principle, not a privilege. At lunch in the mess hall sat across from Anna, who was still wary of their captors but less so with each passing day. "You've seen how they operate," Anna said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Is it real, or are they only pretending because the Red Cross watches?" Hesitated before answering. "If it's an act, it's the most convincing one I've ever seen. Even when no one's watching, they follow the same rules. It's as if decency is their discipline." Anna glanced toward the American guards by the door, two young soldiers, one barely older than the German girls themselves. They were talking quietly, laughing about something mundane. There was no malice, no contempt, just men doing their duty without cruelty. "It's strange," Anna admitted. "They treat us better than our officers did." That comparison was dangerous to say aloud, but it was true. In the Reich's final months, discipline had meant fear. Orders had been enforced by screams, not reason. The Americans, by contrast, maintained authority through professionalism, a difference subtle yet profound. 2 weeks later accompanied Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a Red Cross inspector, on her monthly evaluation of the camp. As translator, she walked beside the doctor, nodding every detail she'd long since grown used to: clean facilities, well-fed prisoners, orderly routines. But this time, she was the one being questioned. "How do the prisoners appear to you, Lieutenant?" Dr. Warren asked as they walked past the medical clinic. "Healthy," answered honestly. "Better nourished than many German soldiers at the front." "And their morale?" Hesitated, cautious, confused perhaps. They expected cruelty and found civility. Dr. Warren smiled faintly. "Civility can be the most powerful form of re-education. People remember kindness longer than punishment." That night sat alone at her small desk in the translator's office, staring at a blank sheet of paper. She had been given permission to write home 1 letter per month. But how could she tell her family what life was like here? That she slept in a warm bed, ate full meals, bathed in hot water, and worked under officers who treated her with dignity? How could she write that her enemy followed moral codes more faithfully than the leaders she had served? Finally, she began. "Dear Mother, I am safe. The Americans treat us well, far better than I imagined. The camp is clean. We receive food, medical care, even books. Please do not believe the stories that say we are being mistreated. They are lies. The people here, they are not monsters." She paused, staring at the ink drying on the page. For the first time, she felt the heavy weight of what that sentence meant. They are not monsters. The next morning brought a new kind of shock. During inspection, Captain announced that the camp would be showing a film in the main hall, a documentary of sorts, she said, sent by Allied command. Attendance was optional, but strongly encouraged. The film, it turned out, contained footage from recently liberated concentration camps in Europe. At first, assumed it was American propaganda, exaggerations to humiliate German prisoners. But when the projector flickered to life, her certainty died in her throat. The screen filled with images of skeletal bodies stacked like logs, children with hollow eyes, Piles of shoes, of hair, of human remains. Allied soldiers walking through camps filled with ghosts. Silence swallowed the room, Anna gripped arm, trembling. "This can't be real," she whispered. "Not us, not Germany." But couldn't look away. Every frame was evidence of something beyond comprehension. These weren't fictions. These were the consequences of the regime she had sworn to serve. When the lights came back on, Captain's voice was steady but quiet. "This is why we treat our prisoners as we do, because we refuse to become what we fight." That night lay awake long after the camp had gone silent. The sounds of the guards' distant footsteps no longer felt menacing. They felt moral, protective. She understood now why their guns hung lightly at their sides. They carried power, but they didn't use it to destroy. And for the first time, she realized that the war she had fought and the lies she had believed had stolen not just her freedom, but her humanity. The days after the film's screening at Camp Clinton passed in a kind of stunned quiet. Conversations among the German prisoners grew slower, more tentative. Meals were eaten in near silence. Even laughter during recreation seemed forced, fading quickly into uneasy reflection. The truth, once seen, could not be unseen. Lieutenant moved through her duties as translator like a ghost, her composure outwardly calm but her mind in turmoil. The images from the concentration camps, skeletal bodies, empty faces, pits of death, had carved into her soul. She had served in the communications corps, far from the of atrocity, yet now she couldn't escape the feeling that silence had made her complicit. Captain Mary noticed the change. One afternoon, as worked quietly in the administrative office, the American officer paused beside her desk. "You haven't been yourself lately," she said gently. "Would you like to talk about it?" Hesitated. "There's nothing to say, Captain." "I think there's too much to say," replied softly. "The truth can be heavier than any weapon." For a moment said nothing. Then, as if the words had been waiting for release, they came in a flood. "Everything I believed in was a lie," she whispered. "We were told that the Americans were barbarians, that capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation, and yet you treat us with dignity, with kindness. Meanwhile, my country," her voice broke, "we built places like that." Didn't interrupt, she let the silence fill the room. "You know," she said finally, "when I enlisted, my father told me that war reveals what kind of people nations really are. Some think it's strength to be ruthless. We believe it's strength to remain humane." Looked up, eyes glistening. "How do you fight evil without becoming it?" Smiled faintly. "By remembering that decency isn't a strategy, it's an identity." That night sat alone in the camp library long after the others had gone to bed. The lamps cast warm pools of light across the tables, illuminating rows of donated books, English and German alike. She opened a volume of American poetry left behind by a previous prisoner, her fingers tracing the faded lines. The words spoke of endurance, of hope, of compassion even in the midst of destruction. She realized then that moral power didn't come from fear or obedience. It came from the refusal to surrender one's humanity, even when war tried to take it away. The following week, Camp Clinton received another Red Cross delegation. Dr. Elizabeth Warren returned to conduct her monthly inspection, this time accompanied by officials from Washington. Now the senior translator guided them through the grounds. The American officers were proud but professional, showing the spotless infirmary, the orderly kitchen, the stocked canteen. The visitors seemed impressed, but it was Dr. Warren's comments that struck most. "Lieutenant," she said as they walked past the recreation field, "the conditions here are exemplary. But what's most remarkable isn't the food or the beds, it's the atmosphere. Your fellow prisoners trust their captors more than they trusted their own commanders. That is a rare achievement in war." Nodded quietly. "They've given us something we didn't know we'd lost," she said, "our dignity." That evening, and Anna sat on the steps outside their barracks, watching the sunset bleed across the Mississippi sky. For the first time, the barbed wire fences didn't look like cages. They looked like boundaries between two worlds, the world they'd come from and the one they had entered. "Do you think the Americans are showing us all this to prove something?" Anna asked. "Perhaps," replied, "but if they are, it's not for propaganda, it's for conscience." Anna looked thoughtful. "And what will we say when we go home?" "The truth," said quietly, "that our enemies showed us what civilization really looks like." A few days later, Captain summoned to the office with an unusual request. "Lieutenant, the War Department is compiling documentation on prisoner treatment for release in post-war Germany," she explained. "We'd like you to help translate and prepare a German version of the report." Froze, you want me to tell Germans that American prison camps were humane. Nodded, not as propaganda, as record. The truth will matter when the world begins to rebuild. As worked on the translation, reading through reports of inspections, medical statistics, and statements from prisoners, she felt a complex mix of pride and sorrow. Pride that such decency existed, even amid destruction, and sorrow that it had taken her captivity to discover it. At night, she dreamed of her homeland, of the smoldering cities, the hollow-eyed civilians scavenging for food, the blind faith that had led them all here. And she wondered how she would face them again. How could she tell them that the people they'd been taught to hate had treated her with more kindness than her own nation ever had? When finally completed the translation, she handed the report to Captain with trembling hands. "This will make many of my ashamed," she said softly. Met her gaze. "Good, shame can be the beginning of change." Later that week, a new group of prisoners arrived, disheveled, hollow-eyed survivors from other, harsher camps in Europe, and Anna were assigned to greet them. As she helped a trembling young woman off the truck, smiled gently and said in German, "You're safe now. This place isn't what they told you it would be." The woman looked at her suspiciously. "Safe in an American camp." His voice was steady. "Yes, you'll see." And in that moment, she realized that she had become the bridge, the living proof that truth could outlast propaganda, that kindness could rewrite even the darkest beliefs. That night, as the camp settled under the soft hum of crickets and the glow of the watchtowers, finally allowed herself a fragile smile. The war that had destroyed her homeland had not destroyed her soul. And for the first time since her capture, she understood that sometimes surrendering to the right enemy could mean reclaiming one's humanity. Spring came to Mississippi with a kind of gentle warmth that felt almost unreal to the German prisoners. The war in Europe was ending. Word spread through Camp Clinton like a quiet wind. Was dead, Berlin had fallen, and Germany was in ruins. For most of the women, the news brought a tangled storm of emotions: grief, shame, relief, and fear for what awaited them back home. Lieutenant listened to the radio announcement in the camp office, standing beside Captain Mary. For a long time, neither spoke. The voice of the American broadcaster carried across the room, calm and solemn. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." Finally broke the silence. "You're free now, Lieutenant." The words hit harder than expected. Free. She had dreamed of freedom during the long nights of Allied bombing raids in Germany, but now that it was offered to her, it felt strange, heavy, uncertain. "Free to go where?" she asked quietly. "Home doesn't exist anymore." The American officer regarded her with compassion. "Then maybe freedom means starting over, somewhere new, with what you've learned here." Didn't answer. She looked out the window at the below, where German women hung laundry beneath a brilliant American sky. The fences still stood, but they no longer felt like barriers. They were boundaries of choice. That evening, a meeting was called in the camp's assembly hall. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson, the commanding officer, stood at the front with Captain and Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the Red Cross. The women filled the hall, faces pale and expectant. "Ladies," Anderson began, his southern accent soft but firm, "your war is over. The United States will begin repatriation of all German prisoners within the next few weeks. You will be returned to Europe, processed by Allied command, and released to begin rebuilding your lives." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some women wept quietly, others stared straight ahead, numb. And then, as the colonel prepared to conclude, rose from her seat. "Colonel," she said, her voice trembling but clear, "may I speak?" He nodded. She turned to face the sea of German faces, women she had lived beside, worked with, argued with, and come to understand in captivity. "A year ago, we were told that the Americans were monsters," she began. "That capture meant degradation, hunger, and humiliation. We believed it because it was what we were taught to believe, but what we found here was something else entirely." The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. "We were given food when our own people were starving. We were shown respect when our government taught us that enemies deserve none. We were treated as human beings, even when we had stopped seeing humanity in others." She paused, her eyes finding Captain in the front row. "The Americans didn't just defeat us with weapons. They defeated us with decency." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. Dr. Warren stepped forward, her expression soft with admiration. "Lieutenant, if you're willing, I'd like to include your testimony in our official Red Cross report on prisoner treatment." Germany must hear this story. Nodded, tears threatening to break through her composure. Then let the record show, she said, her voice steady, that even in victory, the Americans never surrendered their humanity. In the weeks that followed, preparations for repatriation filled the camp. Crates of personal belongings were cataloged, documents signed, farewells exchanged. The atmosphere was bittersweet, relief intertwined with genuine sorrow. Many of the prisoners had formed bonds not just with each other, but with their American overseers. When the day finally came to depart, stood by the transport trucks with Anna and the others. The morning sun painted the camp in gold, and for a moment it looked almost beautiful. Captain approached, holding a small envelope. "A letter for you," she said. "From the War Department. It confirms your service as translator and your exemplary conduct during captivity. It might help you when you go home." Accepted it with a trembling hand. "Thank you for everything." Smiled faintly. "Don't thank me, Lieutenant. Just remember what you saw here. The world's about to rebuild itself, and it will need people who understand the difference between strength and cruelty." As the trucks rumbled toward the gate, looked back one last time. The American flag fluttered above the camp, bright, steady, unashamed. She had come here as an enemy, but she was leaving as something else entirely, a witness to the power of moral courage. Months later, in a bombed-out German city, began the task of rebuilding her life. She took a position as an interpreter for Allied reconstruction efforts, using her English to bridge the chasm between conqueror and conquered. She wrote letters to former captors at Camp Clinton, maintaining the unlikely friendships born from captivity. And when asked about her experience, she always said the same thing. "I learned that war reveals more than cruelty. It reveals character. The Americans showed us that victory without hatred is possible, and that civilization isn't measured by who wins, but by how one treats the defeated." Years later, at a small memorial service in Germany honoring prisoners of war, spoke again. Older now, but with the same calm conviction that had silenced an entire camp. "I once believed strength meant obedience," she said, "but I learned that true strength is restraint. I once believed mercy was weakness, but I learned it is the greatest weapon of all." Her audience, a mixture of Germans and Americans, stood in silence as she concluded. "We went to war believing we were fighting for a superior race. But in the end, it was our enemies who showed us what superiority truly meant: kindness, fairness, and humanity." As the ceremony ended, stepped outside into the cool air. Above her, the sky stretched clear and boundless, the same Mississippi blue she remembered from behind the barbed wire. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Freedom wasn't the day they opened the gates. It was the day I understood the truth." And with that, the former prisoner who had once braced for cruelty walked away carrying something far greater than freedom. She carried the proof that even in war, compassion could triumph over hate, and that the decency of one nation could redeem the conscience of another.